Imagine a world where millions struggle to put food on the table, where families are torn apart by conflict, and where access to basic health care is a distant dream. This isn't a scene from a dystopian novel. It's the reality facing countless people around the globe. As we approach the end of the year, international organizations are sounding the alarm. They've put out their appeals, outlining the critical humanitarian needs they face. But what do these numbers truly represent? What are the human stories behind them? Today, we'll journey through these appeals, exploring the realities of displacement, hunger, and lack of healthcare, seeking to paint a vivid picture of the world's most pressing humanitarian concerns. Keep in mind, this is just a glimpse into a vast landscape. For a deeper understanding, I urge you to explore the full documents released by these organizations. While this episode delves into complex issues, it also offers a glimmer of hope. By understanding these challenges, we can become part of the solution. So, stay tuned as we uncover the stories that need to be heard and explore how we can all make a difference. Always stay safe.
All right, let's dive in. Today, we're looking at the humanitarian appeals for 2025, specifically from UNHCR, UNICEF, WFP, and UNFPA. And, you already know all about this, so let's just cut to the chase. What are the key takeaways for, well, experts like you?
Yeah, absolutely. We're not just going to rehash the reports. The idea is to analyze, what are the connections between these organizations? What are the real insights? What do these appeals really tell us about what's happening globally?
Okay, well, right away, I was kind of blown away by the numbers UNHCR is reporting. Over 120 million people forcibly displaced. That's the highest they've ever recorded. And 70 million of those are internally displaced.
Yeah, and if you really dig into it, that 70 million, it's predicted to double by 2030. Climate change is a massive factor. It just makes everything worse, existing conflicts and displacement, and it's all happening on a scale we just haven't seen before. It's a theme throughout all these reports, really. It's a lot, It really brings home how interconnected all these crises are. So how is UNHCR actually tackling this? They've got these 4 impact areas laid out: protect, respond, empower, and solve.
Right, but what's really interesting are the specifics within those. Internal displacement is a huge priority. I mean, we just talked about the numbers, but there's also this emphasis on finding alternatives to, those dangerous journeys that we see people taking out of desperation. Working with development actors is another big one, along with statelessness and climate action, of course.
Yeah, that commitment to greener supplies stood out to me. A 30% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 for their emergency operations. That's a pretty big goal. But they do talk about some big challenges, like restricted access to asylum.
Yeah, that's a growing problem for sure. And of course, we can't forget about the funding gap. It's a recurring issue, across all the reports. But for UNHCR, it means struggling to find those durable solutions, especially for internally displaced people. It's about going beyond temporary fixes, integrating people into existing systems. And that makes me think of that stat from UNICEF. Almost half of the forcibly displaced people are children.
Oh, think about how vulnerable they are. The risk of violence, exploitation, the trauma. These reports don't sugarcoat it. And that's why UNICEF's focus on child protection is so important.
Yeah, they're doing amazing work, providing healthcare, screening for wasting, mental health support. But like you said, funding is a huge barrier. They have this big funding gap specifically for child protection. It puts millions of children at risk.
It's a reminder that we need to go beyond just the headlines. Sure, the big conflicts get attention, but there are so many children facing these hidden emergencies, and they don't get the same level of support.
It's true. And WFP is facing that same funding gap. They say they need to help 123 million people in 2025, but their budget's actually shrinking.
So then how do you actually do it? How do you deliver with that kind of pressure? WFP is talking about doing more with less, building resilience in communities so they can withstand future shocks, strengthening national social protection systems. It's acknowledging that you need a broader approach for long-term solutions.
And we see that same idea with UNFPA, right? Those mobile clinics they're running, getting sexual and reproductive health services to women and girls.
Yeah.
Incredibly tough places, even active conflict zones.
It's remarkable. And what I really noticed is their focus on community-driven programs, survivor-centered programs. It's not just about providing the services. It's about empowerment, giving women and girls control over their own recovery and well-being.
Right, it's like all these organizations
Yeah.
are trying to figure out this balance, responding to the immediate needs,
Yeah.
but also working towards those long-term solutions.
It's a real balancing act, and that chronic underfunding just makes it so much harder.
For sure. So why don't we shift gears a bit, look at some specific countries to really see how complex it is.
Yeah, good idea.
Sudan, for example. It's a major focus for both UNHCR and UNFPA. UNHCR says it's their biggest individual country need.
And it's not surprising, right? The UNFPA report is pretty grim. Millions internally displaced. Social services are basically crippled because of attacks on infrastructure. It's a crisis on multiple levels. It needs a comprehensive response.
And then there's Afghanistan. UNFPA is really concerned about women and girls there under those restrictive policies.
It's really tough to read about. The poverty and insecurity, and the combined effects on women and girls. It's a situation that needs our attention and our advocacy.
Absolutely. And UNFPA also highlights the Sahel region as one of the world's most neglected crises. Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Mali, Niger, they're all facing this mix of conflict, displacement, and climate disasters. They need so much more support.
It's the same story everywhere, right? These huge needs, overlapping crises, and just not enough resources. It's a lot to process, even for those of us who deal with this every day.
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming, honestly. But at the same time, you see how resilient these organizations are, how much ingenuity they have.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we should look at next, right? Let's move past just the problems and look at the solutions, the ways they're using technology, partnerships, new approaches to make a difference in this increasingly complicated world.
Okay, so we've talked about the scale. But let's zoom in a little on some specific challenges. Shelter is one that really stood out to me. UNHCR is helping over 500,000 households every year, with everything from tents to more permanent housing.
Yeah, but it's still not enough. What worries me is the growing need for shelter in cities. You know how complicated that gets? Displaced people are moving to urban areas, and finding safe and affordable housing, it's a huge problem.
Right, and UNHCR talks about working with local governments and development organizations to integrate refugees into the existing housing systems instead of creating these separate systems.
Exactly, yeah. We need sustainable solutions long-term, not just temporary fixes. And speaking of sustainability, another thing UNHCR flagged was the decline in clean cooking fuel in camps and settlements. A 41% drop in just a year. Across 34 countries, that's a big deal.
It's a huge issue. And not just for the environment. Think about the women and girls who have to collect firewood, putting themselves at risk. And the health impacts from indoor air pollution. It's actually setting back progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Just adds another layer of complexity.
It really does. It shows how interconnected everything is. It's good that UNHCR is pushing for those alternatives, like fuel-efficient stoves and solar power. But again, it comes down to funding.
Yeah, funding. Both UNICEF and UNFPA are calling for more flexible funding. They say all those restrictions.
Right.
Limit how quickly they can respond when things are changing so fast. But what do you think about that push for flexibility? I mean, donors want to know their money's being used effectively.
Oh, absolutely. It's a valid concern. Earmarked funding gives them that control. But these crises, they're constantly evolving. Needs change, priorities change. UNICEF and UNFPA make a good point. Flexibility lets them adapt. Get resources where they're needed most at any given time. It's about maximizing impact, even when there are surprises.
Yeah, and they also talk about something else that resonates with me. That overemphasis on just a few high-profile crises. I mean, those emergencies are important. But it means other situations where millions of people are suffering don't get the same attention.
Right, those forgotten crises. We need to be more aware of them. As humanitarians, as global citizens, UNICEF says they responded to over 400 emergencies last year, but over half their funding went to just 4.
It's a tough reality to face. So with all these constraints, how do these organizations even measure their impact? Are we still just looking at how many people they reach?
No, it's moving beyond that. It's about outcome-based indicators now, not just outputs like, how many people got aid, but outcomes, actual changes in people's lives, measuring the real impact.
Okay, so what does that look like? Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's take UNHCR's work with refugees. Instead of just saying how many were resettled, they look at things like how many refugees can get jobs, how many children are in school. Those indicators tell a better story about how their work actually makes a difference.
It's about empowerment, right? Giving people the tools to rebuild their lives. It seems like a common thread in all these appeals.
It is, definitely. Whether it's cash assistance so people have choices, or supporting community-based protection networks, or advocating for policies that let refugees work. It's all about moving from dependency to self-reliance.
And that brings us back to collaboration. No single organization can handle these problems alone. It takes partnerships with development actors, peace-building organizations, even businesses.
Right, that's exactly the shift we're seeing. It's understanding that humanitarian aid, it can't just exist on its own. It has to be part of a bigger approach to address the root causes and build lasting solutions.
So we've covered the challenges, the funding gaps, the focus on real impact. What's next? What are some of the solutions these organizations are proposing?
Okay, let's move on from the problems and talk about those glimmers of hope, how they're using technology, partnerships, new ways of thinking to make a real difference.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the funding issues, how to measure impact, but there are some really cool innovations coming out of all this. One that I thought was really interesting was UNHCR's Digital Gateway.
Oh yeah, that's a game changer for sure. It's a platform, online, where displaced people and stateless people can get all this vital information and services. You can schedule registration appointments, check your case status, know your rights, find support, all in one place. It's really powerful. It gives people more control when they often feel like they have none.
Yeah, it shows how technology can make things so much easier. And it's not just about information either. WFP is using technology for those anticipatory action programs, analyzing weather patterns and risk data to get food and supplies in place before a disaster even hits. You've worked a lot in disaster response. What kind of an impact do you think that has?
It's huge. It's like instead of reacting, you're prepared. You're reducing the risk, being ready to act early. It saves lives, reduces suffering, and it just makes everything we do more effective. WFP's approach, it's all about anticipating the needs and being ready before things get out of control.
Yeah, it makes you wonder why we weren't doing this all along. And on that note, UNHCR is really pushing for more collaboration with development actors.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, right? The sooner refugees can join the local economies and systems, the less they have to rely on aid. What are some of the most promising examples of that collaboration?
We're seeing more and more joint programs to help refugees start businesses, improve access to healthcare and education, strengthen those safety nets. It's recognizing that humanitarian aid. And long-term development, they go hand in hand. It's like building a bridge between that immediate relief and those lasting solutions.
It's good to see those barriers breaking down. These crises are so complex. We need everyone working together. What other innovations really jumped out at you?
UNFPA is doing some interesting things with cash assistance. They're giving direct financial support to women and girls so they can decide how to best meet their own needs. It's about dignity, giving them agency, recognizing that they know what they need better than anyone.
It's a real shift in how we think about aid. And UNFPA is even exploring how cash assistance can help prevent gender-based violence.
Right, like imagine giving a woman who's at risk of violence the money to leave that situation or to get legal help or counseling. It's such a powerful way to use this tool. It's not just about basic needs anymore. It's about addressing the underlying causes, making things safer.
These organizations are definitely pushing the boundaries, finding new ways to do things. But we can't forget about funding. It's still the biggest issue. All these amazing ideas, they need the financial support to work.
It's true. We can talk all we want about innovation and best practices, but it all comes down to resources in the end. It's on all of us, governments, individuals, organizations, to make sure these agencies can do what they need to do.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this question. What role will you play in making the world a more just and compassionate place? How will you use what you know, your skills, your resources, to make a real difference for the people caught in these crises?
It's easy to get overwhelmed by the scale of it all. But these appeals, they don't just show us the challenges, they show us the incredible work that's being done, the new ideas, and the dedication of the people working on the front lines. There's a lot to think about, but there's also so much hope.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you have a better understanding now of the situation, the key players, and how you can contribute. The challenges are huge, but so is our potential to really make a difference in this affair.